Tom, would you like to start the introductions?
Hi everyone, this is Sephardic World, brought to you by the Sephardic Genealogical Society. Welcome here, especially to our patrons who make possible that all of this happens. Welcome to our viewers on YouTube, and a special welcome to Ian Pomerantz and Judith Cohen, our special guest for today. Ian Pomerantz is a classical musician. He is very much into Baroque, but he is also at home in Sephardic music, and he is a heritage speaker of Ladino and much else. And Judith is also into Sephardic music, and she studies it since, well, I don't know how long, but very long. And her specialty is an anthropological approach to music. And I don't know how many places she has been in the world, but there are not many left, I think. And today will be about the 21st century history of Sephardic music. And I welcome Ian to continue.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for Ton and David for having me. This is a subject that that I'm very passionate about, and I think Dr. Cohen here really got me into it about 15 years ago when we first met, and it's consumed my life ever since. And today we're going to be dealing with Sephardic music from outside of the Sephardic community. Now I'm going to start my PowerPoint here. This picture really says everything that we're going to be dealing with today. There are two major traditions in Sephardic music performance today. You have one that is within the Sephardic community, for the Sephardic community, by Jewish performers. And then you have this parallel tradition that developed over the last century. And that parallel tradition is what we're going to be dealing with today. Now, the picture you're seeing behind you, you're saying, okay, what is this? This was a performance of the Washington Rebels in Washington, D.C. in 2011 that I was fortunate enough to see, because it was called Andalusian Dreams, and that piqued my interest that I might see something interesting. And I did. In back here, you have the King and Queen of Spain, and we have people dancing newly composed flamenco dances to Sephardic music. And the King and Queen of Spain are sitting next to a giant golden 7-branched menorah. And I said, well, I have to do something with that. Of course, we know that there are no extant melodies from of Sephardic melody from pre-expulsion Spain, and we also know that flamenco really didn't become annotated, or at least become a part of the Spanish identity until the 18th and 19th centuries. So I felt that this encapsulated what we're going to be talking about today. This parallel tradition in Sephardic music that we see today all over the world, especially in the United States, in Iberia, and Europe. So how did this get started? How did people who are not Sephardic start having an interest in Sephardic music? For that, we have to go back about 120 years to this man and his colleagues. Now, we call them the Hispanicists in academic parlance. This man was named Manuel Manrique de Lara. He was a Spanish nobleman. Look at his dates, 1863 to 1929. So he's working around the turn of the century. And and he's very interested in the history of his country, and the identity of his country as a great European power, and also a great global power. Its history, fighting the Black legend of Spain, that it is somehow God forbid, an intolerant country. So he goes and he hears Spanish melody. What he says are Spanish melodies in the Middle East, in North Africa, in the Balkans, in Greece, and Turkey. Of course, these are Sephardic singers. Many of them are singing at nightclubs. Many of them are singing at home, what we call the romancero. And he and his colleagues, Pidal is another one of them, one of the collections named Pidal. He starts annotating them and puts them. These academics are the first ones to put them in the context of, this is part of the Hispanic world. This is a part of Spanish music and Spanish identity, instead of this Jewish curiosity over here. Instead of Jewish music, instead of Eastern Mediterranean music, this is Spanish music. Let's just hear what Manuel Manrique de Lara would have heard during the turn of the century. This is Razón de Alabar, also called Ketubah de la Ley, Coplas de Shavuot, sung by Isaac Algaze, who's a wonderful cantor and also a folk singer, but mostly a Hazan. Of Makam, of Sephardic music in Makam in Turkey, in Izmir, at the turn of the century. Look at his dates; he lived about the same time, maybe a generation younger. But this is what Manuel Manrique de Lara would have heard, and the Hispanicists would have heard.
Con temoridad de corazón y alegría y gozo, en el día este santo y temeroso.
I have to get it to stop. So what we heard there, what could we say about that? We are firmly in the Eastern Mediterranean oral world. This is virtuoso makam singing. This is a person who has studied this music for many, many years. He also sings Turkish music. It is in makam. It is Turkish makam singing. It takes much of its influence from Ottoman classical music and Ottoman synagogue song. It is in Judeo-Spanish, what is later to be referred to as Ladino. And Manuel Manrique de Lara and Bendish Pidal heard this and said, this is part of Spanish heritage. And he collects them and he writes them down. Now, he doesn't write them down in makam. What he does is he writes down the melody, and he's very specific about the ornamentation. So we do have some of that in his manuscripts. We have words, but we don't have makam. We really don't have the background of performance practice when we look at these songs in his collection. So that's the Hispanicist. Now, in Europe and in the United States, we have the budding interest of Jewish musicology among Eastern European Jews, and we go to this really interesting character here, Abraham Zvi Eidelson. He's sometimes called, and I don't really like this, but he's sometimes called the father of Jewish musicology. Whether I believe that or not is up for debate. He may have been one of the authors or contributed to the authorship of Hava Nagila. And he is born in, he's a Litvak. He is born in the Russian Empire, in what is today Latvia. And he also travels Palestine, to Oriental Jewish communities, and he starts notating these as well, especially in his volume of what it's called Hebrew Oriental song. Now, when he's dealing with Sephardic communities as well, he also says, I think this music is from 1492 and has been preserved. He says that Manuel Enrique de Lara also says this is Spanish music that must have been preserved. Along those same lines is this German Jew named Abraham Lachmann. And he sees himself as a musical anthropologist. He helps found the musicology department, the Musikwissenschaft department at Hebrew University. And he is very much the Orientalist. He calls himself an Orientalist. He says, "I am a German, but I have a very strong interest in the East." And he starts recording Jewish melodies right here. He's recording Kurdish Jewish melodies, and he also is very adamant that this music is from 1492 and before. So already before the war, this gets us to about 1939. We have already the groundwork of this mythology of ancient music from Spain being sung in Judeo-Spanish by the Sephardic communities. We have some people who are saying already that, okay, this is a part of the Hispanic tradition, and other academics saying this is a part of the Jewish tradition. And those two approaches, they're going to be competing with each other and in conversation with each other throughout the next century as we go on. So then the Sephardic world goes through a crisis, and that crisis is World War II. Of course, most of the Jewish communities in the Balkans, certainly my community in Black Sea Romania and northern Bulgaria, are decimated. Much of the communities all of the communities in Greece and in the former Kingdom of Yugoslavia were decimated. And all of a sudden, there is a gap of several years where Sephardic musicology takes a back seat to other things. So coming out of World War II, in the 1950s, we have this another strange figure, really interesting figure, come along. Now he's Turkish, and the Turkish community is different at this point from the communities in the Balkans and North Africa that were so decimated by the Holocaust and also mass immigration to Israel after the various expulsions after the founding of the state. Turkey is different. Turkey has a stable Jewish community. Turkey was the center of Sephardic life for hundreds of years, and this man, Yitzhak Levy, is from the Turkish community. And the Turkish community is behaving differently because they hadn't gone through such a traumatic event as the 1940s and 1950s. So he's a musicologist, and he begins collecting Sephardic songs from people who were from these Balkan communities, from North Africa, from Turkey, and he, over the course of the next 20 years, he publishes 12 full volumes of music. Now, I'm just showing you the first leaf of the first volume of the first leaf of his great life corpus, Chant Judeo-Espagnol, Judeo-Spanish song. What does this leaf tell you? Okay, not much. It's intentionally removed from its performance practice. Sometimes he will tell you. Sometimes he'll tell you where he got it from. He'll very rarely say who the informant is. Almost never says who's informant him, who actually is singing the song, where the record is located. He doesn't tell us, and he also takes it out of the Makam context. He puts it into to modern Western notation, and he gives you a melodic line with several verses of one version of the song, and that's what he says. This is it. And because it's removed from performance practice, it has its own issues. Now, Isaac Levy makes several recordings for Israel Radio, and we'll listen to his recordings, and you can hear that there's a big difference between what we heard from 30 years before, when Isaac El-Ghazi was singing, to what Yitzhak Levy is singing now. Let's take a listen.
Una pastora yo amí, una hija hermosa, de mi chiques yo la adorí, más que a no a mí. De mi chiques yo la adorí, más que a no a mí. Un día que estábamos en la huerta sentados, le dije yo, por ti mi flor me muero de amor. Le dije yo, por ti mi flor me muero de amor.
So that is Isaac Levy, quite different from what we were hearing in Turkey a few decades earlier, isn't it? He is accompanying himself via guitar. It is very Western. Una Pastora is, of course, a Greek song for Mia Voskopula Rapisa, which is traditionally sung something like Mia Voskopula Rapisa. We really have it removed from its performance practice context. It is rearranged for Isaac Levy's beautiful baritone voice. I have to say, as a classical singer, I really do love his instrument, and he publicizes these songs and his edition as the magnum opus of Sephardic literature. If you want to see Sephardic song, you need to go to this volume. It's almost like he almost had it as an encyclopedia, and he also had amassed a fairly wonderful collection of field recordings. So in 1977, Yitzhak Levy dies, and the unthinkable happens. And I think I still get chills every time I remember the story. You most definitely, if you listen to Sephardic music, you most definitely know Yitzhak Levy's daughter, Yasmin Levy. And in his will, he stipulates that he wants all his field recordings, and this is perhaps at this time thousands and thousands of recordings from communities that were destroyed in World War II, as well as those in Turkey and North Africa. And he asks his wife and daughter to destroy them all by hand. So there's no record of his source material, where he got these songs, other than his word. Yasmin, in an interview, she was talking about that she was ripping the tapes so much that she remembers when she was a little girl, her fingers bleeding. This, I hate to use the word so liberally, but to me, this is an act of cultural genocide. Those would have been such amazing resources, or amazing resources for Sephardic musicologists in the future. But now we really have nothing. But what this did is it really did make his volumes the begin all and end all of where anybody would go, including Sephardic musicians, or including non-Sephardic musicians from outside the community, people of interest, outside musicologists. This would be their first entry into Sephardic music, and we're going to see how that plays out. So for the next, I would say even until today, I just spoke to a Portuguese ensemble who says, their main bread and butter is performing Sephardic music in Portugal. And I asked them, where do you get your material from? Where does your field work? What are you listening to? And they say, oh, we're not really listening to anything. We take Isaac Levy's Chants Judeo-Spanish and go through the songs we like and perform them from there. Of course, we have really nothing from him. We don't have his informants. We don't have his performance practice. We really have nothing besides what he says, with no background resources to compare them with. Go to my next slide here. No. Now, in the 1960s, we come back to Spain. Victoria de los Angeles looks at this volume of Isaac Levy's Sephardic music, and she likes it. And she's also convinced that these come from Renaissance Spain. Now, to me, it's very interesting, as an aside, how this is periodized. So when it comes to Sephardic music, the Middle Ages and the ancient and the Renaissance and the modern all seem to sort of meld together. And for me, 1492 is the Renaissance. It's high Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci was painting, but when we look at what Sephardic music is called, we still see the words medieval or ancient. And I think that is because those words sound great. I mean, what could be more evocative than those labels? So Victoria de los Angeles is a renowned operatic soprano. Her main contribution to music in the 20th century is opera. She sings Verdi and she sings Carmen, and she sings all the repertoire of romantic opera. But suddenly she gets very interested in her Spanish background and the background of music history in Spain. And she releases a CD called Songs of Andalusia, Music of the Middle Ages and Renaissance in 1968. And for this, she takes several Levy collections. She and a group of young musicians from Catalonia arrange them as, how do I say, how they imagine they would have been performed if they were written in 1492 or before. And at this time, she starts calling things romanzas as well, even though they're not romanzas. Most of the songs that she records are just folk songs that were written sometime in the 19th or 20th centuries. They could have been from nightclubs. Some of them actually had authors who were still living in 1968, but they are anonymized. And they become a part of this parallel tradition of Sephardic song that is apparently ancient or medieval. I like to say a little bit of this every single time I do a talk on this, and that is that the large amount of Sephardic repertoire that we hear, or Judeo-Spanish repertoire that we hear called romanzas, are actually not romanzas at all. They're folk songs, and most of them, or or cabaret songs or club songs. And most of them were written during the period that I like to call the golden age of Sephardic song, which is around 1875 to around World War I, a little bit after 1925. Romanzas, however, are these long narrative ballads that do have text with Iberian sources, with contrafacta, that means new music that was applied to them at a later date. And they were, and they're mainly for domestic performance. You don't have a TV, you're not going to watch the news, you're going to sing these narrative ballads with your family, mostly done by women. But they're not very good for recording performances, because some of them take 20 minutes to sing through with only one short melody. But if we take the word romanza and we put it into something that's not a romanza, it gives us a very evocative title. So let's just listen to what Victoria de Los Angeles does with this music that is not a romanza from the Levi collection. And we get the idea. Dr. Cohen wrote a very fascinating paper on the Sephardic response to Victoria de Los Angeles' singing. I wonder if, Judith, you could tell us a little bit about your research.
Hi, actually, I met Victoria de Los Angeles years ago. It was really exciting. It was 1991, and I was just beginning my postdoc. I was in Spain, and they asked me, I got invited at the very last minute to teach Sephardic songs at a workshop in the north, and Victoria de Los Angeles was there teaching opera. And I went up to her afterwards and said something like, "Oh, it's such an honor to meet you," and that kind of thing. And she said, no, it's an honor to meet you. And I just about fell over. She was truly a lovely person, whatever one thinks about operatic treatment of any folk songs. I mean, one of the things I always think about here is it's not about Sephardic folk songs in this case. It's about operatic Western art music treatment of any folk songs. And to me, I mean, you talked about cultural genocide before. To me, that's cultural genocide. It's cultural imperialism. Mm-hmm. Because it's implying, these songs aren't good enough. We're going to take them over and we're going to make them into real music and do arrangements and sing them like real music, which was really the attitude throughout a lot of the 20th century and even to a large extent today. So, that's actually my take on it, but it's not specifically a Sephardic take. It's any folk songs.
Right.
And people say, well, Bartók arranged them. No, he didn't. Bartók actually used his Hungarian folk music knowledge and research as an inspiration, but in fact, he composed his own music. He didn't arrange folk tunes. That said, Victoria de Los Angeles is one of the loveliest people I've ever met, ever. And the reaction, I think you're talking about the article where a couple of women say, "Oh, I'm just so delighted that this wonderful
yes, that's exactly what I'm talking
is singing
about.
our," and the implication is, our lowly music and elevating it.
And elevating it too by with her wonderful voice.
Say that,
right.
But that was kind of, implied in what she was saying. So, here I am from the outside saying what I'm saying, and there is someone from the inside saying that, but that wasn't everybody's reaction. That was one person's reaction. Was it the same woman? No, it was a different woman who, when Esther Lamandier was singing, I put on a recording of the French singer Esther Lamandier, and she said, "Oh, here come the clowns."
I think, yes, we just spoke about that incident, didn't we?
I think on that little Zoom that we're going to use.
Yeah.
As well. Yeah. So, I mean, there are many different reactions to performances of Ladino or Judeo-Spanish or whatever one wants to call them these days, songs by people from other styles. Yeah.
Right. I'll also note that there was and continues to be a Sephardic art song movement by Sephardic performers.
There is, of course, and
yes,
there was
like
a Yiddish
Mario,
art song
right,
movement.
and an English art song music movement and Bohemian art song movement. Sephardic art song movement is no different. Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco wrote beautiful Sephardic art songs. I'm going to be recording some of them this year, but I want to take a moment to separate that tradition, which is much more along the lines of what Bartók did, than what we're dealing with today, which is musicians coming from this neo-colonialist background of, we are going to the East. As Benjamin Disraeli said, the East is a career. And these are our songs now. They're a part of our Spanish heritage. And we are taking them, and they're going to be a part of us. That is what we see going on in this other tradition.
And in fact, I've heard that in Spain quite often over the years, over the decades, in fact. I'll say, but that's really not how this song is sung at all. And they'll say, right, well, it's our song. It's Spanish.
It's our song now.
We do whatever we like with it. And I said, well, where are you from? And they'll say, well, I'm from Burgos, or I'm from, Aragon. And I say, well, if I sing a song from your hometown, any which way that I please, how is that? And they say, no, you can't do that. That's our folklore. You can't change it.
Right, I think that's part of the Spanish institutional process, and a lot of the colonial methodology with many Spanish institutions that are old and venerable is still there, and that is the only way that they know how to approach Sephardic material. I want to pause for just a moment. There have been some questions that I want to ask. One of them from Mr. Bruce Cahan says, Ian, was there a history of lute/guitar/string instruments that accompanies these songs in their 1875 plus period? Yeah, well, I won't say lute because I would say oud. There's quite a history of lute
but Renaissance lute,
but
never.
Not Renaissance lute.
We have
Absolutely
to be really
not
specific that no Renaissance instruments are part of Sephardic.
No Renaissance instruments are part of folklore at all. Now, when we're talking about guitar, around 1885, tango began to influence Sephardic music as more and more Sephardic Jews moved to and from Argentina, and we start seeing Sephardic tangos. So in that repertoire, yes, there is some guitar string instruments. In a typical Turkish Sephardic band, you had modern violin, but you're still playing in makam. There are no Renaissance instruments. There are no hurdy-gurdies. There are no viols. There are no lutes. There are no shawms. I can go on and on and on.
No Renaissance recorders. No
Renaissance recorders. Exactly. That is a new phenomenon that happened starting at Victoria de Los Angeles CD. This sets the precedent of this early music performance practice in Sephardic music. See, the other question was, how do you define romances as opposed to folk songs? So a romanza is very, very specific. It is a specific genre. It is a narrative ballad that has a certain number of syllables.
Okay, hold on. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'll let you.
Something
Sure.
which I really think this is important.
Sure.
I'm going to be a little disagree slightly. A romance is a folk song. It's not as
well. It is a folk. Yes, it is a type of folk song.
There's no opposed. Yeah. A romanza in Ladino or romance in Spanish is a folk song. it's a genre of folk
It's a
song.
genre of folk song. So
So
that's
it's
what I
just
meant
like
to say.
English
Thank you.
ballads, just like, and the real problem actually is the change in the definition of ballad in English also.
Mhm.
And it's exactly the same problem. So ballad in English meant the same thing as romance or romanza in Ladino or Spanish. It was a narrative song. But the ballad
like we see
today
in-
is now
right.
thought of as a kind of sloshy love song.
Slushy love
And
song,
that's
like
how
the
romanza
power
I thought
ballad.
it also. But it doesn't have to be long, by the way. You can have a romance that takes like a minute to sing it. The length is not a defining factor, it's the
No.
structure.
It's the structure of the song. So Judith is exactly right. It is a folk song, but it is a very specific genre of folk song. Our folk songs, yes.
And one of the confusions is that in Ladino we say canticas, which does mean song. Let's just take the word folk out because who knows what folk means.
Who knows what folk means? I've never heard of. What did
Cantica they use as a
Stravinsky say?
general
We've never
song,
heard of
and
horse
a
made music.
romance isn't, used to be at least a narrative ballad.
A narrative ballad. So going back to our, I think that's all the question that we have for now. Going back to our, what is maqam? Maqam is a theoretical practice of dividing an octave that is practiced in Turkey, in the Arab world, and in Persia, and in the Balkans. It is a theoretical concept. It focuses on ajnas or scales that divide an octave in a different way than we do in the West. So you have quarter tones, you have different emotional or cultural underpinnings of various maqams. It's a different music theoretical system that takes a long time, a very long time to learn how to do. Just like in Western classical music, it takes you a long time to study the theory.
I just want to say one thing. It's actually not quarter tones. That was an invention.
That was a Western invention. It's microtones.
It's microtones.
That is the correct.
So there are all kinds of. There's fifths of tones and.
There's fifths of tones. Are right. It's a way of approaching the division of an octave. Let's see. If you want to let's move on.
There was an earlier question by. Sorry.
Yes, we will get to all these questions. So a young viol player of viola da gamba. Viola da gamba is it looks like has a body of the cello, except it's flat on the back, but it has frets like a guitar. It is played with a bow. A young viola da gamba player on the Victoria de Los Angeles recording becomes enraptured with Sephardic music. And his name is Jordi Savall. And he and his group of musicians called Hesperian 20, now Hesperian 21, take this idea of Jewish music, of modern Sephardic music as a part of Spanish culture that was written in the years before 1492, and he runs with it. He gets lots of government funding. He gets lots of press coverages. He goes on tour throughout the world, and the newspapers eat it up. And at every single concert, he says, "This is Spanish music." Jewish Spanish music from 1492. He makes his own album, Secular Music in Christian and Jewish Spain, Secular Music from Christian Jewish Spain. And of course, the whole idea behind that title is that this is the Jewish music that was in Spain. And it becomes very paternalistic, his approach to it. I will read two reviews. One from the anniversary concert done at Lincoln Center and reviewed by the New York Times. Anonymous ancient music from Spain, ancient, ethereal, and earthy. So those are wonderful adjectives, but many of the things are not anonymous. Many of the pieces have authors in Turkey, and this is my favorite from Matthew Westphal. Sephardic romances before the age of expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. Before their expulsion in 1492, Jews of medieval Spain developed a rich and lively culture. Okay. Including an exquisite repertoire of song called romanceros. called romances. No, romances, not quite.
Yeah, we should be clear. People often say romancero because they want to sound fancy.
Right.
But actually, romancero is the anthology.
Is the collection, is the anthology.
Corpus. It's like saying they sang many anthologies.
Yeah. And they kept that repertoire of songs called repertory lives as they settled in places as diverse as Morocco, Bosnia, Turkey, Bulgaria. This is the part that really angers me. Lovely as the romanceros are, they would have languished as objects of obscure ethnomusicological studies and might have disappeared altogether were it not for the efforts of the gifted musicians like Jordi Savall and Hesperian 20. Jordi Savall and his ensemble, fronted by the unique soprano Montserrat Figueras, who was his wife, single-handedly brought those songs to the attention of the modern public with this 1976 recording, now reissued at a bargain price. So here we have Western musicians saving the repertoire from the obscurity that is the Sephardic community and bringing them to the public once again. And I will show you the performance practice of what Jordi and his ensemble does.
I mean, one of the funny things about that album is that it included the Zionist Ladino song called Palestina to lose it.
You're right, and of course that's a Zionist song.
I actually
modern.
met them shortly after they brought that album out when they were still living in Basel.
I encountered Jordi Savall at a talk at Harvard, where again he repeated the myth that these songs are Spanish songs preserved by Sephardic Jews, not Jewish songs, but Spanish songs preserved by Sephardic Jews, that he was returning to the Spanish heritage. And I stood up and I confronted him and I said in English, this is the corpus of musicological work that has been done on these songs. Why do you still say this when every single musicologist, including some of them who are in this room, are saying the complete opposite? And he pretended that he did not speak English and started speaking in French, and which was a gotcha moment because French is my second language, and I asked him in French. And he refused to answer the question. He says, well, let me just show you. And he takes out his viol and he starts playing a very, very slow Porque lloras blanca niña, which is a romanza, on his viol. And then everybody clapped and said, how wonderful. And that seems to be the modus operandi of this group. And as he traveled, and as early music audiences became more and more interested in Sephardic music, we have lots of copycat ensembles. And oh, right, I'm going to show you what he does with this. Jordi has discovered Hijaz, which is the makam. Many times he takes club songs from the clubs in Istanbul and slows them down and makes them what he calls ethereal. Right, he slows them down to a tempo, a meditative tempo, even though they're club songs that are meant to be quite upbeat. This is, of course, A la Una Yo Nací, done at a very slow tempo.
But to be fair, that's what most people do with these songs. They put on this solemn face.
The solemn face, right.
Spiritual, expression and slow them all down. It's not just Jordi and
it's not just Jordi, but Jordi.
And he wasn't the first
helped
to
begin
do it
the
either.
tradition.
Yeah.
So in the 46 years since, he travels around, and other musicians are amazed by the Sephardic song, and it begins to get jumbled together with 19th century ideas of Orientalism and exoticism. You could see that that on a few of these CD covers, and these are modern. The latest one of these, I think, is 2016. We have 19th century Delacroix or French Orientalist paintings of the Middle East. Here is on the Sephardic journey, wanderings of the Spanish Jews, we have a scene outside of the Great Mosque in Cairo. What that has to do with the Sephardic diaspora, I have no idea. So when I like to talk about exoticism, I like to talk about two kinds of exoticism, right? There's the exoticism of place. Sephardic Jews are exotic because they come from exotic places like Spain and Morocco and Turkey and the Balkans and the Middle East. But there's also the exoticism of time, right? These songs must be medieval, which is a time so unlike ours. So there's two of these that are playing together. The early music movement explodes with recordings of Sephardic songs done in the early music style, sometimes meshed with ethnic instruments, quote unquote, what they call ethnic instruments, or instruments from the Middle East or Balkans. These come back to Spain, and they are performed with great gusto by these Orientalist ensembles. I will show you a very, very short video of what this performance practice looks like. I can't stand to watch more than 30 seconds of it, but you are welcome just to see what this might look like. So we have Renaissance instruments, and we have a kanun, which is a Turkish instrument. And we have this singer performer doing this exoticist dance that is not done in the Sephardic community. This is a modern invention, a postmodern invention. That was from the Al-Andalus project Deus et Diabolus in Spain. Before we get to what Judith and I really want to talk about, I want to touch on new trends in Sephardic music outside the Sephardic community among the crypto-Jewish music. Among the crypto-Jews, or a movement calling itself the crypto-Jewish movement, that is an evangelical neo-religious movement coming out of Central and South America, as well as parts of the southwestern United States. This is a community that I'm working with. I don't have permission to name them yet, so I won't tell you what they are, but I will tell you that they are an evangelical community in the southeastern United States. Most of their countries of origin are Ecuador, Guatemala, Venezuela, Honduras, and they call themselves a synagogue. Their synagogue they call Beit HaMashiach, House of the Messiah, referring to their Christian beliefs. And they are absolutely adamant and firmly believe that they are descendants of Sephardic Jews, and that their musical identity proves that. And for the musical identity, they take modern Judeo-Spanish songs and infuse them with new religious meaning, and as well as an expression of their Sephardic identity. Now, we know, of course, that these songs are Eastern Mediterranean and modern in origin, but they're a tradition. I can't call it a fake tradition, but I can call it an invented tradition, that they have been singing them for many generations. This is their Hanukkah celebration. And they sang Flori Yagodas, Otus Candelicas, which was written in 1983. And when I asked a community member, the pastor, how did you learn this song? And he said, well, it is the way my grandmother sang it. And then her grandmother sang it. And I said, that's very interesting to me, because the composer of the song, who I used to be friends with and died this past year, wrote the song in the 1980s. So where did your grandmother learn the song? And she said, and the pastor said, well, what really happened is Flori Yagoda stole the songs from our community, and these are, you can hear the beats. This is obviously a Latin American song, and she appropriated our tradition, and she copyrighted under her own name, and it should be ours. But this seems to be a trend among the crypto-Jewish movement in Latin America and the American Southeast and Southwest, wherein adherents who are otherwise Christian or call themselves Messianic Jews firmly believe that this is a part of the musical identity of their ancestors. And I went to a service, and they synchronized, they synthesized some American Reform temple songs, some Psalter for blessings, Baruch atah Hashem Eloheinu melech haolam, which are of course Ashkenazi, with secular Sephardic music. So now I really want to get to the Tres Culturas festivals and what is happening in modern Iberia, and for that I want to welcome back Dr. Cohen. What is a Tres Culturas festival?
Oh, are you being a rhetorical? Is this a rhetorical question?
This is a rhetorical question.
Oh, so you're going to answer?
No. You please answer first.
Okay, that's not a.
Okay, what are Tres Culturas?
I have to say, actually, it's really funny because I was at a Tres Culturas and the Origins of Flamenco concert in Madrid last night, and so what happened, as far as I can see, when I wrote my old master's thesis on medieval music, like 40 years ago, literally 40 years ago, I said the three religions. I said music and women in the three religions of medieval Iberia, because nobody was saying cultures, people were saying religions. Somewhere along the line, it seemed to become almost like a dirty word to say religions, like the R word, just like the N word or the G word for gypsy. And so we say cultures, which to me is a terrible problem. We talked about this, Ian, the other day, because of course there are dozens and dozens of cultures, and some are shared among the religions and some are not shared. So they might dress similarly, eat similarly, except for the actual rules of kashrut, and so on and so forth. And other aspects of their daily culture might be very similar, but their religion is different. But what happened last night, so of course the three religions are the Abrahamic, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, or which practically speaking was Catholicism, not any old Christianity, of course, like Martin Luther King hadn't showed up and we weren't talking about Russian Orthodoxy. But last night at this concert, it was a group of Gitanos doing mostly a flamenco, very good actually, flamenco concert. But the guy who was speaking said that the three cultures are Sephardic, Arabic, unquote, and Gypsy, well, Gitano. So it kind of left out, for one thing, any Jews who weren't Sephardic and any Christians who weren't Gitanos. But the image that he showed on the slide behind the performers, and the performers were great, but the image that he showed whenever he said the word Sephardic was a bunch of black hat, Hasidic type Ashkenazis at the Western Wall. So we'll have people who went to that concert now have a very, interesting idea of what this is all about. And they sang a flamenco version of the Shema Israel as the one and only example of Sephardic culture. And there was a guy from Morocco, a musician from Morocco, who actually sang something in Arabic, but it wasn't, it could be Berber culture. It could be, it doesn't have to be Arabic. So, but anyway, it's understood to mean Jewish in general and Muslim in general, often confused with Moorish in Spain, and Christian, which is of course Catholic in the context.
We have a question, and I think I do want to clarify. When I talk about the crypto-Jewish movement and crypto-Jews, those are different things. There have been crypto-Jewish communities like existed in Belmonte. There have been crypto-Jewish returnees to Judaism, like what happened in the 17th and 18th centuries in Amsterdam and the Western Sephardic world. Those are not the communities that I'm talking about when I say the crypto-Jewish music. I'm talking about a neophyte community that appropriates Jewish custom into evangelical Christianity in Latin America.
Yeah, because what I wrote in a note in the chat is some of you who were here when I did a presentation here in this series, I guess 2 summers ago now, may remember I said the crypto Jews of Portugal, whom I've been interviewing for the past 26 or 27 years, every year except the pandemic, they never stopped identifying as Jewish. It's not a movement. They just are who they are. But they have no melodies whatsoever that are different from any other melodies. They will have had them, in the beginning of the Inquisition, in the beginning of living secretly, but they will have lost them pretty early on. In fact, the Inquisition stops even mentioning people singing different melodies fairly early on because it would have been too dangerous. So, just to reinforce that this is an entirely different
community
set of circumstances. So you brought up Zaragoza. I was at the first festival of the Tres Culturas in Zaragoza.
That's this picture on the right.
Right. I actually don't have many pictures of it, but I can tell you about it. I had my first cell phone ever, which was a Spanish cell phone. So it's like 2000, I think. And I was sitting on a bus. No, it was 1999. I was sitting on a bus going from Cáceres to Madrid.
Okay.
And my phone rang and I was really excited. Wow, my phone rings, and of course I wasn't thinking about muting or headphones or anything like that. It was a whole new thing. This guy said, I'm calling from Zaragoza. We're having our first festival de las Tres Culturas, and I want you to come and sing medieval Sephardic songs. So I innocently, in Spanish, but I innocently gave him my lecture. We don't have any medieval Sephardic songs. And of course, the Sephardim sang in the Middle Ages, but they didn't write it down, and everything that Ian has just explained. So I can't do that. And he's listened and he said, finally, a great phrase, which I subsequently used as a title of an article. He said, just make it as medieval Sephardic as possible. And when I went and I asked a group of young musicians who were playing saxophone, acoustic guitar, and I forget what else in the streets, in the so-called Arab quarter, the designated Moorish quarter, I asked them what they were playing. They said, well, they told us to make it as medieval Arabic as possible. And they were Israeli folk dances, just, the Israeli folk dances many of us grew up with. That
in the 1960s and 70s.
Anytime from the 50s, 60s, and they were doing some, and I went up to the teacher afterwards and I said, how come you're doing these? And she said, well, I told them they were medieval, but they said to make them
as medieval as possible.
As medieval Sephardic as possible, please. So that was, 20 years ago at the first Zaragoza festival.
How did Tres Culturas festivals, how did this phenomenon get started?
Well, I know how the Ribadavia one got started because they told me. So let me just, you want to stop sharing screen for a moment?
Yeah, yes, please.
Your mind, is that okay?
Please, of course.
So let me go share screen. I just have a couple of pictures here. This is just to give you an idea. So this is in the Ribadavia, and you can see that I'm doing, stop laughing, Ian. It's okay, you can laugh. I'm doing what's called in anthropology participant observation. In other words, I'm studying an event by becoming part of it myself. So I'm wearing a medieval dress that I bought for $10 from the Toronto University of Toronto's Medieval Drama Society auction. And my daughter, who is now, of course, a well-known singer of Sephardic music and flamenco and other things, and is here 8 or 10 years old, is wearing, I think, is it Moroccan or Turkish? No, it's a Turkish outfit that we bought with a Moroccan head covering. And the rabbi, so to speak, and the man in red are husband and husband. They're my daughter's godfathers, actually. And just to give you an idea. So they told me, all the people in Ribadavia, this and this are Ribadavia. They told me that they got started when one of the men had lived in Girona and lived in France for a while. And he came back to the village. It's a very small town. It's, 4,000 people, small enough that there's no buses running through it or anything like that. You can walk everywhere. And he said he was very impressed with the medieval festivals he saw in France. And since it was coming up to 1992 and 500 years since the expulsion, he thought it would be a good time to get some grants from the popular, it was called Escuela Taller movement. And so they got a little grant and they started the festival and they wrote a play. Actually, the guy with glasses was instrumental in writing the play called El Malsin, the Informer. And, the informer about crypto Jews, about secret Jews. And they staged it, and they staged a wedding, which they called, a medieval Sephardic wedding, and started having a whole festival around it. And when it started making a bit of money and bringing in a lot of tourism, City Hall, Town Hall took it over and made it one of their events. So you can see here, this guy, this different rabbi, was a priest. I mean, he wasn't quite a priest, he was almost a priest. And then he got married and his father wanted him to run the family vineyard. So he did whatever you do when you stop being a priest. I mean, there's words for it, but he did it like the right way. But he learned how to read Hebrew. So he, put together a paper, a roll up piece of paper that he calls the Torah. And that's what he's using here.
Is that a little menorah on the altar table?
Yeah, it is, but this is also a cross like up here. It's because it's the Church of the Madalena, and it's not actually used as a church anymore. And every year for this festival, someone climbs up on a ladder and sticks up a non-medieval Star of David on the church, just so one knows.
Because we know during the medieval period, Magan David was,
let's
it's
not
not even
be sarcastic here because some people don't know this. The
Okay.
Jewish star was not a specifically Jewish symbol at the time at all. It wasn't a not Jewish symbol. It just wasn't.
But it wasn't a Jewish symbol. It was a
so all these
ornamental.
people saying, "Well, I found a Jewish star here,
Right.
here." Yeah, sure, but that doesn't mean people were Jewish. So they were singing. Speaking of Flore Jagoda and medieval songs, they were singing Flore Jagoda's Hanukkah song, not Otro Candelicas, the other one, Hanukkah.
Hanukkah.
And it was in August. It was right around now. So it was the end of August, and it was a Saturday.
It's not Hanukkah. Okay.
Well, it also wasn't a day you would.
And
hold
was it the day you would
festival.
hold it in? Right.
It was a Saturday in August, and it was definitely not Hanukkah. And they were singing Flore Jagoda's Hanukkah song because she had been there a couple of years before in that festival that I actually was the artistic director of. And in the film about her, they said that the King of Spain invited her, but actually it was a guy with the glasses and myself and the other guy on the committee who invited her. The King of Spain never knew. If the King of Spain had known, we wouldn't all have been billeted in people's houses, having a good time and having little parties and singing at night.
So Judith, I have a question.
Wait, I'll just finish where
Sure,
we are.
please.
This is the Parade of Jews. It was designated Parade of Jews in the border town of Albuquerque in the south near Badajoz. And as you can, this is a very non-medieval guitar,
Acoustic guitar.
played by somebody who dressed up this way for the Parade of Jews for reasons which are entirely obscure to me. There is one Jewish man in here. He's a former Israeli minister of education, and he really liked hanging out at this thing and sort of taking it over. But everybody else is just from the town and not Jewish. The groom was already married. The bride was already married to someone else that year and had 3 kids. And this is the bride mounted on a donkey, astride.
Which is very Marian. It's a very Marian
Very
image.
Marian. Well, this is very
Yeah.
Marian too. This is supposed to be a Jewish scene up here in Herbas. And they're singing, speaking of songs and their provenance, 3 songs that they told me were medieval. Hamanegila, Hevenu Shalom Aleichem, and Avrish Megalanika, which is one of those nice 19th century Ladino songs that.
Avrish megalanika ke
Very
Amaneser.
famous,
Yeah.
And then very specifically, people like centuries in Spain. They're very fond of centuries. So they told me that was 14th century. But
Okay.
in the festival in Segovia, one of the women said, Os voy a cantar una nana sefardí del siglo XI. I'm going to sing you a Sephardic lullaby from the 11th century.
11th century.
Well, there's a number of problems. There was no Judeo-Spanish language in the 11th century. There was also no Spanish.
Right.
I mean,
It's
there was Castilian, there was Galician, there was Portuguese.
And Judeo-Spanish is an
Catalan.
Ottoman language, as we know.
There also were no lullabies written down of any sort. I mean, people didn't write down folk songs with music. So I said to her afterwards, not in front of everyone, I wasn't going to embarrass her, but I went up to her afterwards and said, but El siglo XI, the 11th century, really? And she said, yes, I know, porque mi tío trabaja en la sección de arqueología de museo, así que él sabe estas cosas. My uncle works in the archaeology section of the museum, so he
He
knows.
knows these things.
So I said, well, if I went up to your uncle and I said that that stone that's labeled 3,000 years before Christian, the Christian era, is really 1,000 years after the Christian era, what would he say? And she said, that's different. So this is the kind of thing you get all the time. I mean, there's many more things I can tell you about these festivals, but once when I asked them, you know, when they had a number of things that were so awful, I don't even have to, you know, I can do a separate talk on them. And I said, well, how would you feel if I did the same thing about Christian history and Christian culture and religion? And they said, oh, that's different. That's like a real religion, you know?
It's not a dead religion, right?
And this is the program, which includes cheerful things like torture. So at 9 o'clock at night, we have torture for a little light entertainment. And in case that wasn't entertaining enough, at 1:30 in the morning, we have an auto de fe, a public burning. Just as, you know.
No.
Yeah.
So this brings me to
3 festivals.
Two, yes. To 2 questions that I have. The first one is this, when taken in context with what the Redujuderías do, what is the Caminos de Sepharad is doing, these are official Spanish organs of tourism. Is this part of Spain recasting itself as a tolerant entity, as a tolerant society, in a modern European context, after many centuries of Castilian zeal against the other? And my other question was, there are many modern Jewish communities in Spain now, and what has the reaction been like from the modern Jewish communities of Spain to seeing Jewish culture treated in this way?
So the answer to the long question is yes, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other reasons too, and we talked about this the other day.
Right.
One of the reasons is really simple. Spaniards like
It's
to have
fun.
They like to have fun. These festivals are a lot of fun, and they like to have fun. I mean, there was a point in Rivadavia at the festival where the authorities issued ordinances stopping people from singing and dancing on the streets because they were having too much fun that wasn't in the program. You know, that didn't go very far. I mean, the rule didn't really
Right.
get.
I can imagine.
So that's one of the reasons. And the second question is, first of all, there's a lot of communities, but there's very few Jews in Spain. There's, I don't know, 40,000, 50,000. There might be more who don't, you know, come from South America, and they don't bother identifying themselves as Jews, so they're not counted. I mean, they're not hiding or anything. They just don't feel that strongly about it. But it's not a lot. You know, it's a very small population compared with just about any other well, I'm going to say immigrant because the Jews in Spain are immigrants or children of immigrants today. You know, most of the other populations are much bigger. The same thing happens in Canada where I live. There's only like maybe 50,000, and they're concentrated in a few cities. So most of them are either in Madrid or Barcelona, and then there's, you know, a community in Valencia that's not that big, and one in Seville that's pretty small, and, you know, scattered communities here and there, but they're little. So the bulk of these 50,000 or so is really in Madrid and Barcelona, and they don't go to these things very often. It's a long drive. You have to get to them, and they're on Saturdays. So if they're religious, they're not going to go there for Saturday. And if they're not religious, they probably don't care that much. So I've never actually heard a lot of I hear discussions like from colleagues of mine, like Dominique Tomasov, who does very intelligently planned, you know, tours of Jewish Barcelona. And, you know, she knows what is and what isn't. She doesn't know the music, but she knows the history. And she's complained, well, not complained as in kvetched, you know, to use a Yiddishism. I mean, she's correctly, you know, identified many problems with this approach. But mostly people, they either don't go or they don't bother, or they just go to have a good time. Or occasionally they actually go and give a workshop. Like one woman I know, a Moroccan Jewish woman in Madrid, was asked several times to give cooking workshops. You know, and they're billed as medieval, but they're not, just like the medieval Hebrew pastries in Rivadavia, as if they spoke Hebrew, and they were all in the form of Jewish stars, which again, were not particularly medieval, but yeah. I mean, it's complicated, as they say on Facebook.
So that is the invention of tradition and how it works.
Yeah, the invention and the maintenance of the invention.
Right. I think we're probably out of time, but
Yeah.
this was absolutely wonderful. I'll open up the floor for a few minutes for questions.
I also want to say one thing. There's
Please.
this thing about valuing old songs, and I mean, guys, Ian and I have a long history of terrific friendship and friendly disagreement about this and that, and it's wonderful. He's one of the greatest people ever to talk things over with. But I think we totally agree on this one. The value of a song is not determined by its age.
By its age.
You can
Absolutely
have
not.
a really boring song that's documented as being 1,000 years old, and you can have an absolutely terrific song that was written yesterday. So when we say that, and you say correctly, and I've been saying that many of these Sephardic songs, the majority of the songs that most people identify as Sephardic or Ladino songs are late 19th, early 20th century. That's not a criticism.
No,
They're
wonderful
the same,
music.
I mean, well,
Many of them are good
some of them are
music,
boring.
and then
they're
some of them
songs.
are not
Like,
good.
let's not,
It's just
let's
music.
not get all
right?
romantic about this.
No, of
They're
course
like
not.
any other repertoire.
They're like any other
right?
repertoire.
They have absolutely terrific songs, fabulous songs that we never want to forget. And they have okay songs, and then they have boring songs.
They have boring songs.
Like everybody else. But so did the Middle Ages. And so does just about every culture have fabulous, wonderful songs and okay songs and not so great songs.
I'm
So
reminded
I
of
just wanted to say that it's not a negative criticism. It's just
no.
a
It's
statement.
I completely agree, and it reminded me of a small experiment I did when I was in graduate school. I wrote a Sephardic song along with a living composer who was alive at a living poet who was alive at the time, and I performed it, and somebody from an early music festival in Texas asked for the sheet music. I said, absolutely, I'll give it to you. It took only 4 months between the time when I wrote the song, sitting in the library of Harvard University, and the performance of the song with medieval instruments, with my name removed and the poet's name removed, billed as medieval. So the space between conception of the song in my brain and performance of the song as anonymous medieval was exactly 4 months.
Well, by the way, Joaquin Diaz, the great Spanish folk singer, collector, folklorist, who also, by the way, was just as important, probably more important, as Victoria de Los Angeles in popularizing Ladino songs in Spain. I would say he was actually more important in the end, and he was the one with the folk style. But he did the same thing with
and the orchestral style. He did those recordings with the the Israel Philharmonic, with the just really expansive romantic recording.
Mostly he did them with guitar and just about nothing else. And he actually was in Los Angeles with the Sephardic community as a very young folk singer when he was 18, 19. So, I mean, it's a really interesting story. But non-Sephardic music, and he's one of the great experts on the Spanish narrative ballad. So he did the same thing. He wrote a narrative ballad, and then he had he planted a couple of people in the villages to sing it. And within no time at all, it was being, this is the way our grandparents sang it.
With little differences, right? There's always a little difference. And it becomes a part of their local tradition. And the thing about
the ballads is they have a structure.
Right.
The narrative. I say narrative ballad all the time now, so people don't think it's like a slush.
I think it's a
song. That they have one of
rock
several
ballad.
The main structure, which is 16 syllables per line, and then there's other structures, but that's like the most frequent one. So it's a formula, and you can write something to that formula. If I don't understand why people don't write more ballads, but.
Is there, I think we have in the chat, just realizing we're talking about cultural appropriation. Well, yeah. For me, cultural appropriation is something natural and normal that just happens. It's part of human behavior. What bothers me is when people say something is a lie. When people say something is what it isn't. I almost expect things to be appropriated. We're living in a globalized environment where music crosses boundaries every second of every day. It is when people decide to use a colonial attitude towards a repertoire, or just lie about a repertoire, that bothers me. We have another. So I think some amount of cultural appropriation is normal. What is going on in the crypto-Jewish movement, though, is a reassessment of identity that is based on something that's not true, and something that affects Sephardic Jews all over the world. So I think that the use of the music will continue. I don't see what I try to do is I try to inform and make things less destructive.
Thank you. Can I ask a question? I mean, when you're going to get a cover of a Boney M song into a sort of Judeo-Spanish cover of a Boney M song into a sort of medieval festival, I think that's what must be achieved.
Yeah.
it's. I mean, it is. I don't know. It is sort of Disneyfication, but don't we now see a phenomenon of people who are themselves Sephardic, sort of doing the same thing? I mean, has it turned into a sort of
has it been internalized?
Yeah.
I think it's been exploited from the inside because
yeah, I agree.
I think the difference is what I hear. I don't know about you, Ian, but what I hear often is young Sephardic people, and of course, the older I get, you know, the more my definition of young changes. But younger Sephardic people, and I'm not talking about Ian, who's a kind of phenomenon in and of himself, who don't really know the tradition at all. Right. And they don't know it any more than a non-Sephardic person knows it, but they lean on, well, you know, I'm Sephardic, so I can do this. And they understand marketing and they understand, you know, how this works and how it sells.
Right. And
so,
I wouldn't say
it's internalized. I'd say it's used.
I will elaborate on that. I still, you know, creo que estoy en lindo mancebo. I think I'm still a little young. I think that in the United States, there is, among young Sephardic people, there is a real desire to differentiate themselves, and from normative Judaism, if they feel like the latter has pushed them aside. And I think a part of that self-creation is dabbling in some of these Orientalist or tropes.
Sure.
And look at me, I'm Sephardic. I have all, you know, I have a tapestry with a belly dancer on my wall, which is something that I've seen. So I think that in that self-differentiation, there is some of that being internalized, and maybe, I mean, I'm sure among performers exploited, but even as just young people who have no intention of becoming musicians, internalize as a part of their alternative Jewish identity that is an alternative to American or North American Ashkenazi heavy mainstream Judaism. So I hope that answers your question, David.
Yeah, in the chat before, Bob was making a point about authenticity, and you know, I belong to a sort of Western Sephardic congregation, and I think perhaps sort of Handel is a major sort of influence on our liturgical music, who presumably didn't come out of Spain in 1492. So I'm not really sure if there's a question in there, but it's yeah, I don't know if we're sort of demanding authenticity of others, if we're sort of just adapting and taking things along the way.
Well, the authenticity argument in the early music field, it's argued to death, and it's become a real headache. Because what does authenticity actually mean for a performer who stakes their entire reputation on cultural authenticity? No, this is the instruments we played during this time. This is how they fashioned their strings. This is how they sung with vibrato and non-vibrato. And the arguments could be so minute and yet so heated. Wait, what did they say? The argument is so heated because so little is at stake. But that's the idea, that people will find a treatise and stick with an argument. It almost functions as religious fundamentalism in some ways, that you find a treatise and that's what the person says and that's what you're going to go with, and certain limiting of creativity there. But what confuses me is that performers historically informed performers will have these arguments over, what the length of the string is, or what the curvature of the bridge is, and then do Sephardic music on Renaissance instruments without giving it another thought. That's really what confuses me about the field when it approaches Sephardic music or Celtic music or now African American music, really anything that's in the ethno category. Judith?
So I was going to say, so I'm from, like Ian, from both the early music movement, in my case more the medieval Renaissance, but also Baroque movement, and the old folk revival movement. So in ethnomusicology, we've thrown out the word authentic a long time ago. If you do it, it's authentic. If you're a person and you're doing it, it's authentic.
If you're perfect, you're doing it, it's authentic.
If I have my ethnomusicology hat on, that's what I have to say. And I'm not saying it right. Hold on a second. Well, everything really is authentic.
Right.
So I have to say it with that serious look, right? But if I'm a folk singer, I'm saying like, yeah, man, like everything's authentic, But if I'm an early music specialist, I actually left my focus on medieval music because I got so tired of saying to audiences and to my students also, we're never going to know what it sounded like.
And it's through the filter of our very
sometimes
powerful
have the rhythms, we have the
imaginations.
pitches. Never mind that we don't really know exactly what the intonation was like. It wasn't the way it's divided up on a piano.
Right.
Never mind that. We don't know what the vocal production was like. We don't know what the vocal timbre, what the color of the voice was like. We don't know anything really, except a bunch of notes.
Right.
So
And what we end up hearing as audience members is medieval music filtered through the very, very powerful filter of our imaginations with all our biases and presuppositions,
but also all the
that are in
people
there.
that we've heard recording. So there are people who think it all sounds like Tom Binkley and Andrea von Ram, and there are people who think it all sounds like, et cetera, et cetera. When I ran my medieval women's group for years, 25 years or so, we just did it in folk style. I mean, we didn't do anything that we thought was not, quote, authentic. But the style that we presented was, presented in coffee houses. We went to coffee houses. We had people singing refrains in 12th century Latin.
Right.
But then we looked at our clothes, and I remember this, and we said, well, what's authentic medieval clothes? Is it France? Is it upper class Paris in, say, the year 12th?
You could go crazy with it.
Or is it, middle class Toulouse in the south of France in the year 1178, or is it the court of Alfonso X in 1251, or like what's
and is it all right that this piece of clothing has an elastic on it, because that's never, but it looks authentic, it looks like something they would wear, and you really can go crazy.
My dream, Ian, is to fit my medieval Viel tuning pegs with fine tuning pegs. And I'm sure that no medieval musician would have turned it down.
No, of course not, because it sounds good.
Anyway, it's also getting late, so I think.
It's also getting late. We better end.
I've taken enough time up. Sorry.
Bernard never had his hands up. Maybe he can.
Yeah, can I start by thanking both Ian and Judith for something that has not just been fascinating, but I think the most fun of any of the talks that we've had. And Judith, in particular, you've partly answered a two-part question that I was going to ask. And the two parts are this. One, about 5 years ago, I attended a triennial seminar about the man who drew the map behind me, which is the 19th century map of Barcelona. And his wife, Clotilde Bosch, was part of a women's feminist collective in the 1860s, which did a kind of job on Catalonia, similar to Cecil Sharp in England. Mm-hmm. She and a lot of women and quite a few men went round trying to find and save existing songs that they were worried were disappearing. But that was obviously in the 1860s. And from when they were disappearing, I don't know. There was a book that was due to come out about her, and I'll try and find that because I haven't read it, but would be fascinated to, although she does appear fairly prominently in a book called 1001 Tales of Activist Women from Roman Times to the Present Day
Bernard,
in Catalonia.
Because it's getting late, can I ask you what your question actually is? Sorry.
Okay, that's one bit. The other bit is I was looking, because I was asked a question about the Chueta Jews, about Catalonia in general, and found on Genie a group called Catalan Troubadours. And so my question is about musicology in Spain or in Iberia in the period between the expulsion and the rediscovery, let's call it, in the late 19th century, whether people are working on that, and if they are, what you know about it, and whether I'm guessing Jews would have been involved in any music that was happening. And Judith gave a brilliant exposition of why it was that whatever they were singing at the time of expulsion probably disappeared pretty soon. But I'm guessing that there would have been Jewish troubadours. I'm guessing that there would have been people involved in music production. When I say Jewish, probably crypto-Jewish, New Christian, and so on. But I wonder.
I mean, sorry, Alec, I'm not sure whether you're asking a question or.
Well, also, musicology is a fairly new field.
Troubadours. First of all, troubadours end. The whole troubadour movement ends at the end of the 12th century.
Right, because of partially because of the Albigensian Crusades.
Troubadours, because that's not a crypto-Jewish. I mean, sure, they were always secret Jews, but
thank you for that.
So there's no troubadours in the 14th or 15th century.
There's a Jewish Minnesänger who is named Suskind von Trimburg in
and he was
Germany.
The only one who actually wrote nice things about his wife.
Exactly, and he wrote nice things about his wife. And
they were. Let me just finish. I wrote my master's thesis on this, so I kind of know about it. I can send you an article. The short answer is yes, of course. Musicologists have worked on this. Why would naturally they've worked on this. A lot is known, but there's just no active known Jews. We do know that they were Renaissance composers in Spain and Portugal with Jewish backgrounds who were composing, but they didn't compose anything recognizably Jewish.
Right. What makes Jewish music Jewish music? Is Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story Jewish because a Jew wrote it? Is Leonard Bernstein's is Leonard Bernstein's White Christmas Jewish because a Jew wrote it? Not necessarily. Yes, what is Jewish music?
There have always been Jews involved in music. There were Jews in music in King Alfonso's court in 1250 in the mid 13th century. There were Muslim musicians at King Alfonso's court. What we have no idea of whatsoever is how much they actually played their own music when they were gigging as court musicians, or whether they did, or whether they hung out and jammed after they did whatever Alfonso told them they had to do, and say that he wrote the songs that they wrote and so on. We just don't know. We don't know. But yes, of course, there have always been Jewish musicians and Jewish poets and Muslim musicians and Muslim poets. And I don't know of any people in the world that doesn't have their musicians and their poets.
Thanks.
Thank you. And we are getting a bit late, so I shall go and order my Aladdin costume from Amazon, so I can be more
so you can be more
Sephardic.
Sephardic.
Yeah, and Ton, would you like to close the meeting?
Yes. Oh, thank you to all who attended, who are mostly our patrons, who support us, and thank you to all viewers on YouTube. And most of all, thank you to Ian and Judith for a wonderful evening, full of music and full of knowledge, and some surprising insights into the history of Sephardic music. There are many tributes pouring in now through chat. I won't go through them. And next week, we will talk about Bevis Mark's archives. That will be David Mendoza and me by way of introduction, and later on in the season, we will have more specialized talks about those archives. Thank you all for coming here, watching and enjoying this. And see you next week.